Hello, everyone. My name is Walt Wadlow. I'm the Director of Utility Relations for the Water Now Alliance, and I think we'll give people just a couple of minutes so that they can make the transition over from the keynote today. So if you just hang in there, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Hello, everyone. My name is Walt Wadlow. I'm the Director of Utility Relations for the Water Now Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you all to Water 101, or if you are a newly elected official, you might think of it as water. What have I gotten myself into? So by now, you have a pretty good idea of who the Water Now Alliance is. But I wanted to let you know today who's actually going to be sharing with you during the Water 101. So I'll be talking about water basics and some of the other issues involved. I'm the Director of Utility Relations. Cynthia Kohler, who you've seen many times on screen, our Executive Director, is going to talk to you a little bit about water law. And then we have Caroline Cook, our Water Policy Director, and she's going to be covering some issues around equity and some other topics as well. So please stay tuned, and we'll try and give you the kind of information which will provide you with a good basis for chatting about water issues, not only within your own entity, but with representatives from other municipalities and organizations that you might want to connect to. So again, you've seen us now. You probably have a pretty good idea of who Water Now Alliance is, but what I want to highlight on this slide is that we are a network. We're a network of local water leaders. And what that means is, even after our summit, you have the opportunity to connect with other elected officials, senior members of management in municipalities and at water agencies all over the United States. And that has value in the long run, even beyond the 3 days that you've spent with us enjoying this summit. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater for elected officials. But if you're not an elected official and you're interested, we're happy to have you here today. We're going to chat about the importance of equity and affordability in providing community water services. We'll handle a couple of questions. Then we're going to talk about funding and financing of water infrastructure, effectively communicating with the public on water issues, identify some resources for you, resources for elected officials, and then some final questions and thoughts at the very end. So with that, I'm going to launch us right into a discussion around some of the basics of water, as this is a Water 101 class. And I will apologize if any of you out there are hydrologists. Please forgive me for the oversimplification that I'm about to share based on this slide. In the United States, the vast majority of our fresh water supply starts out as either rainfall or snow. It falls on the land surfaces and then runs down rivers, lakes, rivers and streams into lakes. Some of it soaks into the ground and becomes available as groundwater. But the majority of the water supply we use comes in the form of precipitation, with the exception of some desalination, which occurs along the coastlines. Precipitation in the United States is highly variable. And you can see from the map that we've got up here, it varies widely across the United States, and it varies not only by geographic location or by amount, but also by season. Generally, in the eastern part of the country, in the Northwest, and the mountainous areas of the West, precipitation is possible year-round. This map also shows that the annual amount of precipitation in the continental US varies from less than 5 inches per year to over 180 inches per year, and over 400 inches a year in parts of Hawaii. What this means is municipalities in different parts of the US often face different water supply challenges. But there are similarities as well, especially when it comes to stormwater and wastewater. Just as the water supply varies widely across the US, so does water use. This shows the average amount of water used per person for domestic purposes. In general, municipalities in drier states use more water per person. Think landscape watering, for example, but local conservation practices can dramatically affect this. You might want to try and understand what your municipality's gallons per person per day, or GPCD, is. That's a way of having conversations about how much water gets used in your municipality. Except for limited amounts of desalinated ocean water that I mentioned earlier, the majority of the municipal supply in the US comes either from surface water, that's streams, rivers, or lakes, or from groundwater pumped out of underground aquifers. And the mix of these two types of water supply varies across the US and even within states, depending on what water is most easily available. Most groundwater comes from what are called aquifers. These are underground areas of rock, sand, or gravel, which contain water stored in the spaces between the sand, gravel, or rock grains. Think of a gallon jar filled with gravel. If you pour water into this jar, it will fill up all those little spaces between the rocks or the sand inside the jar. That's something like an aquifer. In the real world, the water gets there from rain or snow, or because we purposely let it soak in from ponds or inject it into the ground. Now, one of the challenges that many parts of the US face is that they are pumping out groundwater faster than it can be naturally or artificially replenished. This figure that we just were looking at showed the areas of the US that suffer from groundwater depletion. The figure on your screen now shows that we also share the challenges associated with drought. Many people traditionally thought of drought as only something that was shown for the Western states, something that the West experienced, but nobody else did. But if you look at this, you can see that drought is in fact shared by multiple parts of the country, some parts you might not even have thought of. This, in fact, this shared challenge nature is the premise behind the formation of the Water Now Alliance, and why we're so thrilled to be working with all of you. You can see from this graphic that drought is something that we share across the entire United States. Okay, with that brief overview of water in the US, let's turn our attention to the 3 types of municipal water systems that I've already mentioned: water supply, wastewater, and stormwater. And we'll begin with the water supply system that delivers drinkable water to homes and businesses. This graphic, which we borrowed from the North Texas Municipal Water District, illustrates some of the basic steps that water goes through on its way to customers, residential, commercial, or industrial users. Their supply happens to be surface water pumped from a lake, cleaned and made safe for drinking, tested at laboratories, stored in tanks, and then delivered as needed to end users. The vast majority of surface waters in the United States must be cleaned and treated to be made safe for use. Although there are a few systems, generally whose origins are in high mountains or entirely projected watersheds, that are considered pristine enough to undergo less treatment prior to delivery. Groundwater sources vary. Some require less treatment, some require more. Another of the shared challenges facing municipal water systems throughout the United States is aging infrastructure. Just as our roads and bridges are aging, so too are our water, stormwater, and wastewater systems. Pumping plants, underground pipes, treatment plants, and tanks, they all wear out. Water systems, like people, need more maintenance as they age. So keep your eye on President Biden's infrastructure bill for the large amount of water system funding that it includes. Now let's talk a little bit about wastewater. What happens after we've used the water for drinking or cooking, flushing toilets, manufacturing, etc.? Well, for many of us, out of sight is out of mind. But for senior members of management and elected officials who have oversight responsibility of a wastewater system, this isn't an option. So after it goes down the drain, where does it head then? Well, in simple terms, wastewater from laterals that exit residences and businesses, et cetera, that water flows into sanitary sewer mains, which then flow into sewer trunk lines. And these trunk lines convey the wastewater and all that's contained with it to a wastewater treatment plant. There, the solids are separated out and the water is treated so it can be discharged into a river, a lake, or the ocean. In some communities, the water can filter into the ground or evaporate. Different wastewater treatment plants treat wastewater to different levels, typically either secondary, tertiary, or more advanced treatment. And the level of treatment required is driven primarily by the sensitivity of and the regulatory requirements associated with the water body that the wastewater treatment plant discharges into. So wastewater treatment plants are complex operations, but basically what they do is they remove the solids from the wastewater coming in, that's called influent, for separate disposal, and they treat the remaining water so that it's safe to discharge into a water body. The water that they discharge, called effluent, has to meet standards established by the EPA and/or state regulatory authorities. One only need read or watch the news to know that many communities struggle with their wastewater discharges and their impact on the surrounding environment. The current trend, interestingly, is that wastewater is not just something to be gotten rid of as quickly as possible, but rather it's a resource to be used. The idea is clean it up as needed for reuse and make it part of the overall water picture. Non-potable, that is not drinkable, reuse for irrigation or industrial water has become common in many communities. And potable water reuse for after advanced cleaning is making an appearance in communities across the nation as well. So the third major municipal water system is stormwater. Simply stated, this is the water that falls as either rain or snow on our land surfaces like fields and roads, streets, sidewalks, and empty lots, and needs to be collected and conveyed to streams, channels, and lakes to avoid flooding. Familiar parts of this system usually include the gutters in the streets, ditches and channels, and a term you might not be familiar with, drop inlets, often with grates in the streets. You know, if you've seen the movie it's where Stephen King's Pennywise the Clown hangs out and invites us to come float with him. But floating with Pennywise in stormwater is not a great idea. Beyond the obvious risks of hanging out with a deranged clown, stormwater just isn't the same as rainwater because it picks up all sorts of contaminants as it flows across turf, concrete, and pavement. So I want to encourage you to learn more about your community water system. Again, whether you're a senior official in city government or you're an elected official, find out who's responsible for water supply, wastewater, and stormwater for your community. And if you're a council member, do you have oversight responsibility? Find out where your drinking water comes from and how your wastewater is treated and where it goes when it's discharged. Find out if you have flooding problems. Is your stormwater well managed or does your system need additional work? And are water, wastewater, and stormwater services affordable and equitably provided across your community? And we'll talk more about that in this presentation today. So how do we think about water going forward? I love this quote, which is from Professor Robert Glennon at University of Arizona. He said, "We've built all the dams worth building. We've built the equivalent of one each day since the Declaration of Independence was signed." And if you think about our infrastructure and you've been paying attention to the news lately, you've seen that the American Society of Civil Engineers issues an annual report card for America's infrastructure. And unfortunately, they gave drinking water a C-, wastewater a D+, and stormwater a D. Again, pay attention to the new infrastructure proposal by President Biden to look for money to help rectify some of these challenging issues. Now, the new reality is that we have to think about water as one water. It's all a resource. Growth doesn't have to mean an increase in water demand. Instead, it means that we have to, as is shown here, we have to integrate our water. We have to decentralize our water facilities and make use of all the water resources that we have. Traditionally, our approach to water management has been a very centralized one. With good reason, only the government or designated water utility providers have been trusted or able to afford the facilities and complex systems needed to provide the full suite of water management. It is important that these services be integrated across the municipality, but increasingly, we realize that on-site technologies and strategies can perform many water management functions. So we need to expand the concept of what infrastructure means. We need to think about it as an on-site water solution, where we use decentralized on-site systems and technology to augment our conventional, already built infrastructure. Oftentimes, it's less expensive, it offers multiple benefits for the community, and it can restore an enhanced watershed and ecosystem functions. Lots of communities have already started down this path with high efficiency appliances and fixtures in homes and businesses. In the commercial sector, water gets reused and there have been upgrades and retrofits to make the commercial and industrial sector more water efficient. Other communities have used smart technology, which allows both residents and businesses to determine that they have a leak earlier and get on top of it so less water is wasted. Still, other communities have invested significant efforts in converting the landscaping from the traditional lawns into native landscaping for the geographic area that they're located in, which is much more water efficient. New technologies like smart irrigation controllers are starting to find their way into homes and businesses around the country. For example, there's a technology that will actually use your Wi-Fi at your house to go out, grab the weather forecast, adjust your irrigation accordingly, and then based on how much rainfall or snow actually falls, go back and make up for any deficit in the irrigation, which is just phenomenal to think about. And then other communities have invested in technologies like rainwater capture or laundry to landscape, where you actually reuse that water from your laundry to irrigate outside at your house. And on a more commercial, larger scale, there's on-site non-potable water reuse actually taking place in buildings where water that falls on the rooftops is reused within the building for flushing toilets. Still, other communities that deal with stormwater challenges use constructed wetlands, both to clean up the stormwater as it's flowing to some channel or river, but also to let part of it sink into the ground so that they can take advantage of it again as a resource. And now with that quick overview of major municipal water systems and a quick look at where water management's headed, let's turn to a brief overview of the law relevant to municipal water systems. As an elected official or senior manager with oversight responsibility, it will be important to have a basic understanding. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to our executive director. Cynthia, you're on.
I should probably come off mute if you guys are going to hear me talk about this. Hey, everybody, I'm Cynthia Kohler. Thank you, Walt. That was fantastic. I get to do the legal piece because I am a water lawyer and recovering litigator. I'm also an elected member of my own local water utility board, so I have a sense of how challenging it can be for decision makers to understand the complex legal environment in which you're working. So I'll be providing you with a very high level review of the legal framework that provides the context for much of what you do and how you need to do it. Next slide. For purposes of today, we're going to cover 3 issues. The water rights framework in the US, federal and state clean water statutes, and then a few other environmental protection statutes that utilities encounter. Next slide. The basic legal construct for water in the United States emigrated to the country from England, but unlike other aspects of sovereignty, ownership of water did not go to the new federal government, but to each of the states and then to new states as they entered the Union after that. This is because English common law goes back even farther to the Roman Institutes of Justinian, which held that water, like air, is a common resource held in trust by the state for the benefit of the people. This matters today because all state water rights flow from this premise. For your purposes, it's the reason that cities and utilities have to obtain the legal rights to most drinking water supply in their state governments, from their state governments. As we'll discuss, the federal government's legal role in water is primarily regulatory, based on power delegated to it by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Next slide. Fighting over water rights is older than the Republic, and those fights are not limited to conflicts between neighbors, but include complex disputes between municipalities and even states. This is due in no small part to the essential nature of water for life, public health, prosperity, but also because of the way water rights laws have evolved in different regions over time and the lack of clarity about who owns what, where. While it may sound obvious, it's hard to craft a set of legal rights to a renewable, constantly changing resource. Next slide. One thing to appreciate is there is no national system of water rights. There are instead two common law water rights systems, more or less divided by geography. Under the riparian system, which is prevalent in the East and the South, and most of the South, the owner next to the stream has only that owner has rights, and water has to be used on the land adjacent to that water body. And in times of drought, you take your reduction proportionately. The second system, used mostly in the west of the Mississippi, is the prior appropriation doctrine, also known as first in time, first in right. Let's go to the next slide so you can see that on the map. It's hard to believe now, but the premise of the first in time, first in right system as it evolved in the 18th and 19th centuries in the American West was to move water out of streams and rivers as fast as possible in as large amounts as possible. For farmers or miners who would be able to establish a right by being the first to pipe it and move it, all they had to do was demonstrate that that water was being used for a beneficial use, which is now a term of art. So the key attributes of first in time, first in right versus riparianism are the water has to be moved away from the stream, it has to be used beneficially, and the amount of water for the beneficial use must be reasonable. The main characteristic of first in time, first in right is that the senior water rights users are entitled to use all of the water to which they have the legal right before junior rights holders take any, regardless of conditions. So as the map indicates, these systems have evolved and become more complex over time as states have imposed more systematic approaches to the establishment of water rights. In some areas, notably California, they operate with mixed riparian and appropriate rights systems, which makes for lots and lots of work for water lawyers everywhere. Today, it is no longer possible to simply stake a claim in water. The states have complex adjudicatory systems that establish the governing issuance of water rights and changes to them. Nevertheless, these systems remain governed in large part by the legal foundations of the riparian and prior appropriation systems. It's worth noting that water law in most states is undergirded by the vague concept of reasonableness. That is, all water must use a current standard of what is reasonable. So for example, what was reasonable in 1950, perhaps to use 1 million gallons of water a day from a river in Sonoma to spray grapevines to avoid frost, is no longer reasonable in 2021 in the middle of a drought. California even has the concept of reasonableness of water use enshrined as a constitutional right. Next slide. Any conversation about water rights must also acknowledge the rights of Indigenous people. Tribes are sovereign nations, and the United States Supreme Court has long recognized the primacy of their water rights. Tribal water rights are governed by an entirely separate body of federal law that recognizes the unique status of these rights. Tribes often hold the oldest and therefore most valuable water rights, particularly in the West. Resolving ongoing disputes of water rights that have been unfairly or illegally denied to Indigenous people continues to be a major issue in many parts of the country. Next slide. One quick, somewhat anachronistic doctrine that is still relevant today is the public trust doctrine. As municipal leaders, you are unlikely to run into this in your day-to-day. We've included it here because this doctrine holds that there is a limit on what water right holders can do with their water rights. The public trust doctrine, as interpreted by the United States Supreme Court, holds that water is a public right held in trust by the state for the benefit of the people. In practical terms, this means that water rights can be modified, even those held by your city, your county, or your local water district, by the state to protect water resources. This is similar to, but different from the reasonable use doctrine, in that what was acceptable environmental degradation in 2005 may no longer be acceptable today. And the state retains the right to modify water rights in response to changing conditions. This is relevant to you as municipal leaders because, for example, the operation of municipal dams and reservoirs may adversely impact aquatic resources or result in declining fisheries, and the public trust doctrine has been a vehicle for modifying utility rights to ensure sufficient flows for a basic level of ecosystem health. Next slide. Another key thing to know about water rights is that they are usufructs, one of my favorite words, the right to use, but not the right to own. This is a critical distinction and foundation affecting city and town and utility water rights. Cities and utilities don't own the water they provide to their citizens, businesses, and institutions. They only own the right to use that water, which again can change and evolve according to concepts of reasonableness. Nevertheless, at the same time, water rights are property rights, and therefore they can be transferred, meaning they can be sold, they can be leased. In the West, but also in other parts of the country, water transfers of various kinds are likely to be of increasing importance to municipal water decision makers. Transfers and other changes in water use are again regulated by state and not federal law. Next slide. Like farmers and ranchers, municipal and individual water rights users, all municipal water suppliers, cities, towns, municipalities, special water districts, or private companies, everybody needs to obtain legal authorization to the water supplies that they're providing to their customers from the appropriate state agency. They can also be obtained via contract. You can buy water from a supplier with water rights. So for example, many cities in the West have contracts with the Federal Bureau of Reclamation for use of water in Bureau reservoirs. But of course, the Bureau had to first obtain water rights from the state authorizing agency to capture and use the water stored behind those federal dams. A great deal of the nation's water supply is also obtained from groundwater pumping, which for many decades was largely unregulated and anyone could drop a well just about anywhere. Apparently, Justinian and English common law only cared about surface water, which we can go back and argue with them, but it'll be hard. This is an extremely complex area of law, and so we're really going to skip past this today and just say that like surface water, groundwater pumping is now largely regulated by the states. And finally, there are other sources of water coming online, such as desalination, which may be subject to other legal requirements. So with that, we're going to shift gears, next slide, and talk about federal jurisdiction. And the main statutes that you really need to know about are the Federal Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. They operate on top of the state water rights framework. Public utilities must also comply with these state and federal regulations that were enacted primarily to protect public health and safety. The Drinking Water Act was enacted in 1974, and it's the primary law establishing health-based drinking standards for more than 90 contaminants. It's been amended a number of times to continually increase and strengthen public health protection. Over 92% of the US population is supplied by community water systems like yours that are required to meet all of these health-based standards all of the time. The Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972, and it establishes the basic structure for regulating discharges of pollutants into the waters of the United States and regulating water quality standards for surface waters, again, not groundwater. The Clean Water Act includes the nation's basic pollution control programs, such as setting wastewater standards for industry and national water criteria for pollutants in surface waters. You may have heard of the NPDES system, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, which regulates how much contamination can be discharged from point sources, such as your municipal wastewater treatment facilities, to our lakes, streams, rivers, and oceans. The Clean Water Act also regulates stormwater discharges to water sources. The Municipal Stormwater Program regulates stormwater discharges from municipal separate sewer systems, say that 4 times fast, known as MS4s, and that operates nationwide. Stormwater permits are required for discharges from systems serving over 100,000 people. The basic concern is that stormwater flows over land and it collects pollutants. One municipality may discharge stormwater from hundreds of thousands hundreds or thousands of widely dispersed outfalls to a variety of lakes and streams and estuaries or other water bodies. MS4 permits authorize public entities like yours to discharge pollutants from these public stormwater systems to the waters of the United States. To close out on the Drinking Water and Clean Water Acts, two more things to know as local leaders. Both of these statutes involve cooperative federalism, meaning that EPA administers these statutes in partnership with the states, which have all enacted their own versions of these statutes and have very elaborate regulatory procedures and enforcement mechanisms. For MS4 challenges in particular, we're seeing an increase in the use of consent decrees governing how individual municipalities will meet their pollution control obligations over time. And finally, both the Clean Water and the Drinking Water Acts also establish state revolving funds, known as SRFs, which provide very low-cost loans to water providers to invest in various types of water infrastructure. Even with these critical loan programs, which distribute billions nationwide each year, as you all know, local ratepayers now account for 95% of all spending on wastewater and water infrastructure. Next slide. In addition to these statutes, and I'm just going to touch on these very quickly, there's a number of other statutes that may or may not affect you as local decision makers. These include the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaties Act, Superfund. All of these things can be an overlay depending on what's happening in your community and impose additional statutory requirements. Phew, so that was a lot on the law. With that, I'll hand it back over to Walt to talk about water services in your affordability of water services in your community. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia, for that really quick overview of the legal structure surrounding municipal water use. I just want to take a second and say thank you. I see questions popping up actually in the poll section. We won't have time to answer all the questions. We'll try and grab a couple during the middle and a couple at the end. But then we're going to give you a reference to an online resource you can use to explore more about the questions that you do ask. So let's shift now to discuss a policy issue that's really on your plate as an elected official or as a senior manager with oversight responsibility for water services. The two issues we want to chat about now are the issues of affordability of those water services, think rates, and equity across the community in the provision of those services. So we'll start by looking at affordability. And I'd like to acknowledge two friends who work as consultants in the firms they work for because they provided me with the great already developed content that I'm going to share with you today. I'd like to thank Sanjay Gar of Raftellus and David Mitchell of MCube for generously sharing the affordability slides that I'm about to present on this topic. So affordability is about understanding whether a community can afford to pay for the essential water services that they need and that you provide to them. So why do we need to pay attention to this? Well, this graph, based on Federal Reserve economic data, shows that since 2003, household spending on the essential services of water, wastewater, and trash, the blue line, is increasing at a much faster rate than household income of the lowest 20% of households. That's the black line. This doesn't mean that the growth in rates for these services aren't needed, but it does point to a growing affordability issue for households in the community. The good news is that we can still get on top of this issue because water services appear to still be affordable relative to other monthly utility costs, as shown in this data taken from New York State. The slide asks which one you couldn't live without. Of course, if you happen to have kids at home, you might not want them to decide between water and internet, for example. Please remember that when we talk about affordability, we're talking about the ability of a household to pay for water or wastewater services, and we're not really discussing the collective capability of the utility provider to pay the cost of providing those services. There are a couple of commonly recommended components used to assess affordability, and the acronyms on this slide aren't important. But first, how much of a burden are we placing on low-income households? And second, how prevalent is poverty in a community or a portion of the community? Those two things taken together can give us a good read on the affordability of our water services. So to understand this better, let's look at an actual case study from Santa Cruz, California, a small city of about 65,000 people. So how did M Cubed approach this in Santa Cruz? Well, if you look at this, they actually broke the city up into census block groups. And then they looked at how affordable water was in each census block group. They looked at disposable income, they calculated affordability ratios, they looked at poverty, again by census tract, within each group, and then finally came up with a score for affordability for each of those census blocks. This map looks at water and sewer affordability ratios. So you can see by census tract within the city of Santa Cruz, where water and sewer is a smaller percentage of household income, those are the light colors, and where it's a larger percentage of household income, those are the dark colors. And as you can see, there are some distinct geographic differences even within one city in terms of affordability. If you look at this map, it shows poverty prevalence, again by census tract, within the city of Santa Cruz. The maps are similar, but not identical. And that's why we use both measures to try and get an assessment of affordability. If you put these together, you get an affordability assessment by census tract, and it maps where in the community water services are and are not affordable. This can then be used as the basis for decisions about service provision, assistance to community households, outreach, new water projects. All of these are influenced by your understanding of the affordability of service in your community. And now we're going to turn to Caroline for some perspectives on what equity means.
Thanks so much, Walt. So in addition to the affordability issues that Walt talked about, when it comes to local water management, decision makers also need to ensure that their projects and programs are equitable. So at Water Now, water equity means universal access to secure, affordable, safe, and healthy drinking water and wastewater and stormwater services. An equitable water infrastructure should support the long-term sustainability of our waterways, water systems, and utilities. Putting these ideas into action takes intentionality and sometimes expanded view on stakeholders and how to engage them, among some other issues. So the good news is that a growing number of utilities are increasingly taking steps to ensure everyone in their service areas can participate in and enjoy the benefits of water use efficiency, conservation, and green infrastructure, and other distributed water management strategies. These communities provide solid examples for water leaders embarking on centering equity in their decision-making. So I'll walk through just a few quick snapshots. So as was featured in yesterday's Powerful Partnerships program in Chicago, the Space to Grow program transforms Chicago schoolyards into beautiful and functional spaces to play, learn, and just enjoy being outside. The schoolyards also use special design elements to help deal with neighborhood flooding. So the program, which is led by the Healthy Schools Campaign in Open Lands, also uses a unique model that brings together capital funds and leadership from the Chicago Department of Water Management, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation of District of Greater Chicago, and Chicago Public Schools. And as we also learned in the Powerful Partnership session, these projects really are built on relationships. As another example, in Cleveland, Water Now is working on implementation of the Water Champions program, a 2-year pilot that will use grassroots outreach to serve at-risk communities. The City of Cleveland Division of Water and the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District are working closely with CHN Housing Partners, a trusted local nonprofit that's already implementing affordability programs. They're working together on this outreach. So as another example, in Aurora, Colorado, they use a similar workforce training program to reach residents using the Mile High Youth Corps Energy and Water Conservation Program to install energy and water saving measures and educate residents on behavioral changes they can make to become environmental stewards in the home. Through the program, core members learn the customer service skills and get technical training skills necessary to participate in the green economy. You can also learn about Aurora's program on the Powerful Partnerships session recording. And finally, in Los Angeles, local nonprofits run a similar program to maintain specific green infrastructure projects. The city has also created an entry-level class for maintenance crews that is available to both companies and NGOs that are paving the way for a diverse array of candidates to maintain these GSI sites. So to bring these types of equity-focused programs together in one place, along with other resources for building equitable water infrastructure, Water Now's Tap into Resilience Toolkit includes an equity module that features additional real-world examples, ways to build equity-focused programs, and types of equity-based programs like direct installs and grants. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the toolkit and how to find it in a little bit, but I think with that, we are at our first Q&A break. Walt, take it away.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm thrilled to see so many questions actually showing up in the polls section. Thank you for adding those. I'm going to grab just a couple now and go through them. We'll have another quick Q&A at the end, and then we're going to give you a reference, an online toolkit that Caroline mentioned, which can also provide you with answers to many of the questions that I see showing up in the chat. So let me just grab a couple of these quickly. How is climate change affecting the issues you've discussed? What should local leaders know about how climate change will impact water management and sustainability in their communities? Huge question. There is information on that in our Tap into Resilience Toolkit. And some of you may have had an opportunity to actually see the whole session that we did on that here at the summit. In general, things are getting wilder and more variable, and you need to think about the future in a different way than you have the past. That's why we talk so much about distributed infrastructure, but there are lots of elements to this question. And so I'm going to refer you to our Tap into Resilience Toolkit to find some of those. Somebody else said, how would you recommend local leaders continue to learn about and engage with these issues? Again, I'm going to point you to both our toolkit online and making connections with other water leaders that are involved in the Water Now Alliance. In your experience, have local leaders faced challenges getting others on board with these types of distributed solutions? Can you share any advice on bringing my colleagues and other stakeholders onto the same page? Well, we're going to talk in this session a little bit about communication with the community and stakeholders, but I think a lot of it is finding other communities that have had successes and being able to use those to demonstrate to your colleagues and to stakeholders how it might work in your municipality. And finally, you mentioned the Biden administration's proposed funding for water infrastructure in the American Jobs Plan. Could you speak more about that? Again, that's something we were able to have a session on this summit and actually touch on that. That is another gigantic topic. And I know I've seen it starting to be covered in the news much more extensively in the last couple of days. So if you stay tuned in on that, I think there's going to be a lot coming out to explain that. And with that, as a very quick Q&A section, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia once again, who's going to talk to you about funding and financing for water infrastructure. Cynthia.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. And thanks for those great questions. I think we are on to the next slide. Okay, so providing water services for a community is a very expensive undertaking, as I'm sure you're all aware. Water is heavy. It takes a lot of effort to move it, store it, clean it, and understanding how to pay for it is fundamental to your oversight responsibilities. These are what we have identified as the critical elements of municipal finance. You have a governing board that manages rates, the budgeting process, debt, capital planning, and financial reporting. There's more, but we'll just start with that. Next slide, please. One of the most important things to understand as an elected official is the existence of GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, the most powerful nonprofit organization that almost nobody has heard of, but it really is central to almost everything that we do as utility managers, directors, and decision makers. GASB establishes the rules that specify how municipalities manage their financial, their financial affairs. And that's important. It's the public's money. So the idea is that these rules should be credible. They should be consistent for state and local governments and establish their reporting. Next slide. Unlike other types of infrastructure, local agencies account for 95% of water spending, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater nationwide. That means that we are all carrying a much more substantial responsibility than for other types of infrastructure. Next slide. There are two types of costs, and apologies if this is too basic, but sometimes this does get lost in the decision-making world. The 80% of water utility costs are generally fixed but water use is variable. So revenue from billing is variable even though your costs are fixed. And it's one of the major problems with the business model for water utilities in the country. So that's something that, in fact, I'm sorry, I'm stuttering a little because somebody asked about this. The short answer is to the question about whether there are other models other than pricing volumetrically is yes. And I think more and more utilities will be moving to those other models to account for the reality that it really doesn't matter how much water we all use every day because so many of our costs are fixed. We have to pay our billing departments. We have to, treat the water. We're not working in a situation where using less water means that the utility has less costs. Next slide. The most common sources of revenue for utilities are the ones you really see here. It's really all about rates. There's some use for investment. Certainly there are municipal bonds and SRF loans and other sources of debt like that. But in terms of bringing funds in, it is for the most part rates. Some utilities also have access to special fees or property taxes. But part of the challenge for utility decision makers is that unlike other municipal services, water is so heavily dependent on rates. Next slide. There's a lot to be said about rates. So here we're going with just the basics. Again, it is the largest source of funding for utilities. And this is really where your source of funding comes to cover salaries, benefits, annual operations, maintenance, your debt service, and sometimes also capital improvements. This is where people talk about pay-go. Next slide. Municipal bonds, really this is known as Muni Bonds. These are bonds issued by your local government or territory or one of your agencies. This is the debt instrument of choice for most cities, towns, local districts, special districts nationwide. These can also include green bonds. There really is no difference between a green bond and a regular municipal bond other than a green bond is packaged to support sustainable greener solutions. But in the basics and in their operations, they're basically the same. The benefits of green bonds are becoming clearer and clearer for those of you who attended the debt session earlier this week. Investors really like green bonds. They're very interested in ensuring and telling their investors that they are investing in sustainable green strategies. Credit ratings agencies are telling us that there's a real interest in green bonds, that they certainly are not downgraded from a bond rating perspective for being green. And in fact, they can sometimes be upgraded. They are the fastest growing sector of the municipal bond market. In 2019, about 157 billion worth of green bonds were issued. Next slide. So consideration for rates and debt. We've talked about the importance of having affordable and equitable rates, but a utility also has to ensure that it has sufficient revenue adequate for covering ongoing operating costs and for capital projects. So what does, and we've talked a little bit, I think, also about intergenerational equity. Think of it this way. Are the ratepayers who will benefit from an investment the ones who are paying for it? Is there a match or a mismatch between those who are paying and those who will benefit? So for many people who are concerned about debt, and certainly I'm among them, we need to think about debt as a way of ensuring that everybody who is benefiting is paying. There's really no reason to put all of the burden for a system that's going to last 30, 40, or even 100 years on the ratepayers of today. Next slide. Traditionally, municipal bonds have been used to fund centralized gray infrastructure, built infrastructure, your pipes, your tanks, your tunnels. Following an effort by Water Now and several of our partner organizations, GASB has clarified that municipal bond proceeds can also be used to finance some of the distributed infrastructure we've been talking about this week at Tap into Resilience. So infrastructure that's not owned by the utility, but that is paid for it and located on private property. So that can include green infrastructure like green roofs or bioswales, permeable pavements. It can include, as Walt pointed out, energy, water efficiency, turf changeouts. These things are considered to be assets by virtue of the water they save. So they can be paid for and financed with debt instruments like municipal bonds. Next slide. In addition to rates, there are some other sources as well, as I mentioned briefly. If you're interested in more information, I'm going to direct you back to Caroline's Tap into Resilience toolkit that she's discussed, and we'll revisit that again in a little bit. Next slide. There are also some federal funds to help, and this was another question we saw. The Biden administration is now proposing $111 billion in federal aid. Whether that gets through Congress is one thing. If those of you were here yesterday heard Representative Huffman discuss, there's now been a $50 billion water infrastructure piece of legislation introduced on Capitol Hill. So we'll see. What it means for local district management is not clear, but it's unlikely to change management as much as provide a new source of federal funds, likely in the form of loans, but it can be very, very helpful in moving forward on some of these critical projects. Next slide. Okay, so that brings us to the next piece of our presentation today. This is a little unusual for a Water 101, but because of the moment that we're in and the changing relationship between utilities and their consumers, we wanted to include this section on communicating effectively with your constituents, because more and more utility relationships depend on building those partnerships with your consumers, with businesses, institutions, and other agencies. Next slide. The first thing to emphasize about effective communications is that it is our most important tool. The most important tool here is trust. Investing in a long-term communication strategy will build, forgive the pun, a reservoir of trust with your community, and that is essential. Next slide. Local water leaders and utilities struggle with communication challenges. It's a hard nut to crack. From talking about rate increases to explaining rate structures, clearly communicating the importance and value of water as a service is a tough sell. Next slide. Experience tells us that effective communications requires a long-term strategy of outreach and engagement with the public to build brand and understanding. A long-term strategy will build that trust and a basic level of understanding about the value of water locally. You can also pursue short-term strategies when you're addressing specific local needs. But overall, the more you invest in this relationship, the easier it will be to address issues and crises as they arise in a way that resonates with your community. Water Now's three foundational communication themes are the message, what is the substance of what you're saying, the timing and frequency that you're conveying the message, and the vehicle for delivering the message. Next slide. The first element is just getting your message right. What are you saying and how are you saying it? This comes down to content and tone, which have to resonate in your community. This means being intentional about tailoring messages for your audience. Messages in New York are not necessarily going to be those that resonate in Georgia or, the American West. Next slide. Conversations about water tend to be limited or non-existent, except when things go wrong. This is why we really emphasize this issue of timing. This leads because when constituents only hear about water issues and water utilities in a negative light, that's not good. So a key to building trust is to be visible and heard in positive ways in your community on a regular basis. Next slide. Our third communications piece after what and how often is where. We need to be creative and we need to be more diversified in the vehicles that we use to message to our constituents. It's fine. Bill inserts are a great thing. Websites are great, but not everybody is using those vehicles. We need to be where our constituents are, whether it's next door, Twitter, other forms of social media, bus ads, whatever it takes in your community, but know where where your constituents are getting their information and be there. Okay, next slide. So just to go back quickly, digging into creating messages that resonate locally. Developing a good message starts with investing in the community you serve and really knowing your audience. You can get a good sense of where your constituents are through avenues like email, surveys, and social media. Don't feel you have to resort to fancy or expensive research initiatives. Once you have a sense of your audience, you can establish your top line talking points. So here's some examples. Remind ratepayers that water is essential. It may work in your community to begin with the broad notion that water is fundamental to everything we do. It often helps to remind ratepayers of the bigger context of what a water utility does, with messages like high quality public water is critical to our quality of life, or reliable water supply is the backbone of the local economy. Next slide. Growing consumer awareness around the value of water infrastructure and the need to invest in it is critical. We've all experienced ratepayers who have the sense that because water falls from the sky, it should be free. It can be helpful to remind them in a friendly, upbeat way that it doesn't make it into your faucets or bathtubs without a large public investment in infrastructure. Next slide. Another strong approach is to connect your conservation message with cost savings with messages like this. Water use efficiency helps keep rates affordable by limiting the need for expensive new capital investments. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about those timing and frequency issues. Consistent and diverse outreach is key in developing a relationship with your ratepayers. Not only is it keeping up a steady drumbeat of good news, but also making sure that your top line messages are what's being pushed out. Picking and sticking to a message and then steadily moving it into your community will make long-term communities much more effective. So part of that is seeing what else is happening in your community. Don't try to do too much at once. Plan with other leaders, agencies, and departments as much as possible and position the utility as a community partner. Next slide. So finally, vehicles and channels. We've talked about this a little bit, but we like this slide. It's a little dated, but we think it's still relevant. This is from a Black and Veatch study that asked several thousand water utilities about the programs they're using. And as you can see, the vast majority of them are relying on their websites, which is great. People are online, but you then need a way to get them to your website. It's passive. So this is where creativity comes into play. Social media, free media, news stories, op-eds, public events, once we're past COVID, of course, are all great complementary communication vehicles to balance out and move your traffic to websites. Next slide. As elected officials or decision makers in your communities, you know the importance of getting out in your community. I want to emphasize again, this is all assuming we're all being COVID safe. You want to partner with utilities, schools, parks, transit, show up and meet people where they are, community events and fairs when they start happening again, public meetings. Identify your most sensitive audiences, the ones most likely to show up, or the ones who will be most impacted and not likely to show up, and reach out to them. For example, seniors may not be on social media or likely to go to your website, so you'll want to explore other avenues for reaching to them because they're among the groups most often impacted by changes in rates and services. Next slide. Finally, trust works when it goes both ways. Make information available to your constituents. Don't hide the ball. Having a foundational layer of understanding and trust is what makes communications about complex issues easier. Ultimately, these strategies are critical for moments of change in your community. We're using this example from Denver Water because they were straight out there in a way that utilities are often afraid to be. Your water bill is going up slightly. It's cute, it's fun, and it gets the point across, and it builds a sense of authenticity. So with that, I believe I am turning things back over to Caroline.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. To wrap up our presentation portion of the program today, I'm going to cover just two of the many resources that WaterNow provides to local leaders. So the first is that you've heard about a few times already is the Tap into Resilience Toolkit. And you can find the link to the free online resource in the chat on the Pathable page. But the toolkit, in addition to the equity elements that I already talked about, includes a lot of additional resources. It's designed to help you plan for, finance, and adopt localized infrastructure solutions like the water use efficiency programs, green infrastructure, and on-site reuse that we've been talking about today. The toolkit itself, it contains self-guided online modules with answers to financing, tax, legal, accounting, and other implementing questions that you might have. So the next resource, perhaps the ultimate Water Now resource, is membership in the Alliance. And Water Now members get direct access to new updates on resources, past resources like the communications workshop that Cynthia mentioned, as well as sign-on opportunities to make your voice heard as a local decision maker on key funding and other policy matters. So if you have not done so already as part of your registration for the summit, you can join for free. And the link also available on the Pathable Files tab, and we can get a link in that chat tab as well, so that you can all sign up and become Water Now members. So with that, I hope that this information, oh, and I'll also mention the toolkit includes access to the Ask an Expert portal, which gets you direct support, pro bono support from our panel of finance, tax, accounting, and implementing and practitioners working on these localized infrastructure solutions. And you can connect directly with them for support to your community specific questions. And so the link to that is also available in the chat. It's a very short online form that lets us know what your questions are so that we can direct you to the correct expert panelists. So I encourage everyone to take advantage of that amazing resource. So with that, I will turn it over back to Walt to close us out with our final Q&A.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And thank you to everybody who attended this session. I know we threw a tremendous amount of material at you in a very short time. And again, the purpose here was really to set you up for learning more about your individual systems, how they're financed, what kind of innovations you're undertaking in your own community by talking to the right groups of people. So we had a question along those lines. Somebody asked, if I'm looking to learn more about these issues in my community, who might be the best people to reach out to talk with? My local water department, planning department, etc. I'll say yes right away to both of those. If you're a municipality with a water department or a wastewater department, maybe Public Works handles stormwater, you definitely want to take the opportunity to talk to the people who actually make those programs run. Planning departments are critical because that's part of determining how water supply is going to be met. Is it going to be an integrated approach that incorporates all types of water as a resource, or is it more along the lines of the traditional kind of gray infrastructure approach? So talking to the planning department will give you that sense for how your municipality is going about meeting their needs. The other thing I would suggest is, again, just to highlight what Caroline said about the Tap into Resilience program and the Ask an Expert part of that. You have pro bono available to you experts in the various fields surrounding water issues. Please take advantage of those individuals, take advantage of that program through our online Tap into Resilience Toolkit to really get in-depth answers to almost anything you want to ask around the water issues that we've talked about in this introduction today. Somebody else asked, I'll just tackle one more here. Somebody else asked our thoughts about navigating water management across different scales, local, regional, state. Are there any good starting points? Again, that could be probably the topic for a whole presentation, but the starting point is local. That's where the money is spent. That's where the projects are undertaken. So I would suggest starting at the local level. Once you understand your local situation, it puts you in a much better position to have discussions at the state level about policy, or to engage even with the federal government on what your needs might be and how it might match up against federal funding. So starting local, I think, is always a good advice in terms of building your knowledge around these issues. So having covered a couple of questions, I simply want to thank you all for attending Water Now. and encourage you to attend our upcoming sessions that we still have online for you today, and also the networking opportunities. So if you look at your screen, you'll see at 10:45, we have green stormwater infrastructure success stories, and another panel, East meets West, on on-site reuse and water efficiency. Both of those are going to be great panels, well worth your time. And then also enjoy the opportunity to do a little networking in the networking lounges that we've set up as well. Those also are a great source of information. And with that, I'm going to round us out today and say thank you one and all for attending Water 101. Remember, you can always contact any of us at Water Now to get more information, as well as using the online Tap into Resilience Toolkit. Cynthia, do you have any final comments?
Just thanks everybody for attending. I know we threw a lot at you. I really want to thank Walt. This is his baby. He did a fantastic job. We are so fortunate to have Walt with us to run this, and we'd love your feedback. We'll be sending out an email later on, looking with an evaluation and some survey questions. So thanks in advance for participating in that, and thanks all of you for being here.
Thank you, Cynthia, so much. And with that, we have a wrap.